think of the Reformation, they mainly think of one man, Martin Luther. But within one generation, another figure rose whose theology would shape much of Protestantism, much more deeply than actually Luther did, and his name was John Calvin. Today we take an in-depth look at Calvin and his role in the development of the Reformation. Some people think that Calvin just clarified Luther, what Luther stood for, while others say he took Christianity in a completely different direction. Good day everyone. We're talking today of taking the actual development of the Reformation further. We're actually dealing with the three major characters of the Reformation in the first century. We're dealing with Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Jacobus Arminius. So these three theologians actually are probably the most influential in terms of the development of the Reformation. In the early years, we had Martin Luther, of course, started the Reformation in 1517 with the 95 Theses, but within a decade, by about the mid-20s, 1525, he wrote a book entitled On the Bondage of the Will, and that actual book sort of refers to the whole idea of Luther's belief that mankind took no part in their own salvation, that it was entirely the work of the grace of God. And this was something that he took from Augustine's writings. Augustine in the 4th century had a big sort of a controversy, a big argument with a guy called Pelagius. And Pelagius believed that people's free will was, people were born neutral and their free will was designed and strong enough to actually gain salvation. And of course, Augustine actually rejected this notion because he seen it as nullifying the effect of Jesus Christ's death on the cross. He rejected Pelagius and he actually strongly emphasized the role of God's grace in salvation. Luther come along and he takes a certain view of Augustine's writings in this regard, especially his writings in regard to his anti-Pelagian writings, and he sort of extends them to a certain extent, and he develops this idea in the book called On the Bondage of the Will, which later is called total depravity, and it's also called complete inability and various words like that. But it develops basically from Augustine's writings. And of course, John Calvin then is a teenager when this book was written. Calvin was born in 1609. He's about 15 or 16 years of age when Luther writes this book, and Luther becomes a big hero in Germany at that time. All through the 20s, actually, he's a hero. And to young Calvin, he's an idol. And Calvin treats him as almost like as if this is gospel, what actually Luther is writing. He doesn't understand that Luther is actually taking a sort of an extreme view in terms of Augustine's writings in his arguments against Pelagius, and he extends them further. And actually, John Calvin's life work is largely an extension of this development of the bondage of the will. He first calls it words like complete inability or total depravity, and that leads on to a situation where if human beings have no part in their own salvation, it's all due to the glory of God, it's all due to the power of God. A central aspect of John Calvin's theology is the whole idea of the sovereignty of God. And from that develops the whole idea of predestination. Human beings have nothing to do with their own salvation. God does everything 100%. So therefore, that naturally leads to a belief system that some are elected and some are actually condemned. And that in turn leads to this concept of double predestination, which Calvin develops, I think reluctantly actually, because he recognizes that it has various different types of traps, but he's a very logical guy. He was trained as a lawyer, and he has a very strong common belief with Luther in faith alone, scripture alone. He's anti the Pope. His father was thrown out of the church, excommunicated. That was a very serious situation at that time. So he's only a very young man, not much lower than a teenager when some of these things happen. But he develops this theory anyway of double predestination, and it's a theory that splits mankind into two groups. One, the elect, and the other, the people that are not actually part of the elect, which Calvin believes are actually condemned. So the Calvinists actually have this sort of very select view of themselves, that they're part of the elect, and that's good in itself. But then we have, towards the middle of the century, we have a man who is Arminius, and he actually begins to look through all these doctrines of Calvin's again, and where his rationale comes to in relation to the development of his predestination theory. And he recognizes that it's not actually in line with some of the actual moral theology of the Bible itself in the overall comprehensive sense, especially the books that Luther regarded as not scripture, especially the books of Sirach and the Book of Wisdom. It contradicts the whole idea. Those two books actually contradict the whole idea that man's free will stands for nothing, because those two books are all about the whole idea of moral theology, and various different great theologians like Thomas Aquinas quoted hundreds of times from these books. And the idea of Luther coming along and saying that he didn't classify them as actually scripture, Arminius was unhappy with that, because he recognized that the development of predestination was actually a different direction in terms of theology than what was in the Bible itself, even if there were books in the Bible that actually were somewhat downgraded by Luther. Of course, even the King James Bible in 1611 actually still included the actual 7 books that actually Luther downgraded. But Arminius was unhappy with this whole development of predestination. He rejected it, and his followers after he died, of course, then actually objected to the overall strict Calvinist predestination theology. And that created a big sort of conflict within the Reform movement, and that led in turn to the Synod of Dort, which actually basically threw out the Arminian ministers, but it emerged as a doctrine later. So effectively what happened was Luther breaks from the Catholic Church and moves in a certain direction, and Calvin takes up his theory and his logic, and he's a lawyer. He sees basically things in legalistic terms. God is a judge. The people are guilty. They're all totally depraved. And Christ comes along and pays their fine, and this whole idea of imputed unrighteousness. And predestination, some people are born to be damned, other people are born to be elect, Calvinists and people like that. This is his theory. And he moves further away from the Catholic Church with all this sort of theology of predestination. Arminian comes along, he looks at the overall comprehensive view of it, and he moves back towards the Catholic Church in terms of Arminianism is all about recognizing that actually Calvin has gone too far with his predestination theory, with his idea that there's no free will, that free will plays no part in salvation. Recognizes that basically Calvin is wrong in that regard, and he pulls the entire Reformed theology back towards the Catholic Church. That's basically my understanding of the life of and the theology of Arminianism. So thanks for watching for today, and I intend to actually summarize a lot of these things next week and cover the entire first century of the actual Reformation movement from 1517 until the Synod of Dort in 1618, 100 years later or so. So thanks very much for watching today, and please subscribe to the channel. Goodbye for now.